Imagine this scene. You're a Persian scout hunched in the boulders overlooking Thermopylae. It's 480 BC. You've been dispatched to evaluate the fearsome Spartan forces blocking your advance. You anticipate discovering iron fortifications and Titans honing their weapons. Instead, you observe warriors seated on bare earth, unclothed, meticulously grooming their flowing locks and rubbing oil into their flesh. You sprint back to King Xerxes and relay that the adversaries are behaving like ladies at a bathhouse. Xerxes chuckles. He assumes they've lost their minds, but standing beside him is an exiled Spartan monarch who remains silent. He pivots to the great king and murmurs the chilling reality. The Spartans don't groom themselves from vanity. They only arrange their hair when they recognize they're approaching death. What you witnessed wasn't a recreational pursuit. It was a funeral ritual. Those warriors aren't planning to witness another sunrise. Before we explore these buried chronicles of endurance and anguish, if you appreciate discovering the concealed truths of history, consider smashing that like button and subscribing for additional content like this. And please drop a comment below to inform me where you're watching from. I find it extraordinary that we're excavating these ancient tales together from disparate corners of the planet, bound across time and distance by our collective fascination with the past. The reality is, those 300 warriors were never intended to occupy that position. In Sparta, it was the period of the Carneia, a religious festival where military action was strictly prohibited. To mobilize an army during the Carneia was a transgression against the gods, punishable by execution or banishment. The Spartan government refused to deploy. They instructed the remainder of Greece to await the full moon. But King Leonidas recognized the Persians wouldn't pause. He understood if he obeyed the regulations, Greece would be consumed by flames. So he discovered a technicality. He couldn't mobilize the army, but he could assemble a personal escort. He dismissed the youthful, elite cadets who typically held this privilege. Instead, he hand-selected 300 seasoned veterans. He maintained only one criterion for this assignment, a detail that confirms this was a suicide mission from inception. Every warrior he selected had to possess a living son back in Sparta. Leonidas wasn't constructing a tactical squad. He was guaranteeing that when these warriors perished, their family lineages wouldn't perish alongside them. When he departed from his wife, Queen Gorgo, she didn't request him to return safely. She requested his final instructions. He didn't respond, "I love you." He responded, "Wed a worthy man and bear worthy children." He was already deceased. They marched northward to the Hot Gates, a confined pass where the mountains collide with the ocean. There they joined a coalition of approximately 7,000 other Greeks. It sounds substantial until you examine what was approaching. Xerxes was transporting the largest invasion force in human history up to that moment. Contemporary estimates position it at 200,000 soldiers. This wasn't an army. It was a migrating metropolis that consumed rivers until they ran dry. They had marched entirely from Asia, traversing the ocean on a bridge constructed from vessels. Now they sat encamped on the plains of Trachis, transforming the horizon into an ocean of campfires. Xerxes waited 4 days, convinced the Greeks would flee when they witnessed his numbers. They remained motionless. Frustrated, he dispatched a messenger to the Spartan formation. The messenger didn't present terms. He merely gestured at the massive Persian army and delivered a simple directive: "Surrender your weapons." Leonidas stood at the vanguard of his 300 fathers. He didn't deliver a speech, he didn't negotiate, he bellowed back 2 words that embodied the Spartan essence: "Molon labe," come and seize them. To grasp why Leonidas's defiance was so stunning, you must comprehend precisely what he was confronting. We frequently envision the Persian army in cinema as a chaotic horde of slaves propelled by whips. That is complete fabrication. The force staring down the Spartans was the most sophisticated, wealthy, and technologically advanced military apparatus the world had ever witnessed. Herodotus, the Greek chronicler, alleged Xerxes transported over 2 million warriors, and that when they paused for meals, they consumed entire rivers until dry. While contemporary historians have refuted the millions assertion, the reality is nearly as terrifying. Most estimates settle around 200,000 combat troops, plus a massive train of support personnel. In 480 BC, that wasn't an army. It was a migrating supercity. It was larger than the population of nearly every Greek city-state combined. Mobilizing a force this magnitude required logistics that bordered on supernatural. 4 years, that's the duration King Xerxes invested preparing for this invasion. He didn't merely march, he reshaped the geography of Earth to accommodate his requirements. When his fleet confronted a dangerous peninsula at Mount Athos, a location where a previous Persian fleet had been destroyed by tempests, Xerxes didn't risk it again. He commanded his engineers to excavate a canal directly through the land. They carved a shipping lane through solid rock and sand for 1.5 miles, merely so his navy wouldn't have to navigate around a corner. Then there was the Hellespont, the narrow straits separating Asia from Europe. Xerxes constructed 2 pontoon bridges connecting nearly 700 warships together with flax and papyrus cables so massive they weighed as much as tree trunks. He paved the decks with timber and soil so the horses wouldn't glance down at the water and panic. He literally walked his empire across the ocean. This was the authority of Persian logistics. They maintained supply depots staged entirely along the Thracian coast, stockpiling millions of pounds of grain years in advance. They were an unstoppable industrial force. But this massive magnitude was also Xerxes' greatest vulnerability. A force of 200,000 warriors creates a ticking clock. They consumed provisions and water at a rate that is difficult to comprehend. Hundreds of tons of wheat and thousands of gallons of water every single day. The land couldn't sustain them for long. Xerxes couldn't simply besiege Thermopylae and await the Spartans to starve because his own army would starve first. He had to maintain movement. He had to break through. This positions the Battle of Thermopylae in a new perspective. It wasn't merely a clash of blades. It was a clash of time. Leonidas didn't need to eliminate everyone. He merely needed to halt the clock. Every hour the Spartans maintained the pass was an hour the Persian beast grew hungrier, thirstier, and more desperate. Xerxes recognized this. Seated on his throne, observing the tiny formation of Greeks obstructing his multinational steamroller, he must have experienced a combination of fury and anxiety. He possessed the numbers, he possessed the engineering, and he possessed the God-given authority to rule. But he was stuck in a bottleneck. He commanded the assault. He didn't dispatch the elite troops first. He dispatched the Medes and the Scythians, conscripted soldiers from the periphery of the empire. Many were lightly armoured, carrying wicker shields and short spears. They were courageous warriors, but they were about to be fed into a meat grinder designed specifically to destroy them. The massive Persian Ocean was about to funnel into a space no wider than a country lane. The logistics that transported them there no longer mattered. The engineering didn't matter. The wealth didn't matter. Now it was merely geometry. Leonidas did not select this battlefield by accident. In the ancient world, geography was destiny, and Thermopylae was a masterpiece of defensive selection. In Greek, Thermopylae translates to the hot gates. The name originates from the natural sulfur springs that bubbled up from the foot of the mountains, filling the atmosphere with the smell of rotten eggs and steam. To the superstitious soldiers marching toward it, it must have appeared and smelled like the entrance to the underworld. But strategically, it was a choke point. In 480 BC, the coastline was different than it is today. Back then, the sediment hadn't yet pushed the sea backward. The pass was incredibly narrow, a strip of land sandwiched between the vertical limestone cliffs of Mount Kallidromos on one side and the Malian Gulf on the other. At the middle gate, the point where the Greeks rebuilt the old Phocian wall, the passage was only about 50 feet in width. This 50 feet of dirt is the most critical character in this narrative. It is the reason the battle occurred at all. In military theory, this is designated a force multiplier. It didn't matter that Xerxes possessed 200,000 warriors. It didn't matter that he possessed cavalry, chariots, and archers. In a space that narrow, a massive army is paralyzed. The Persians couldn't flank the Greeks. They couldn't surround them. They couldn't utilize their superior numbers to overwhelm the formation. They had to advance head-on in a column, funneling their vast ocean of soldiers into a tiny stream. This signified that at the point of contact, the odds weren't 200,000 against 7,000. It was 100 Persians against 100 Greeks. And in a fair fight, warrior to warrior, Leonidas favoured his odds. This brings us to the warriors standing behind that wall. While the legend focuses on the 300 Spartans, we must give credit where it is deserved. Leonidas was commanding a coalition. Standing shoulder to shoulder with the Spartans were roughly 7,000 other Greeks. There were warriors from Tegea, Mantinea, Corinth, and Phocis. There were 400 Thebans whose loyalty was questionable, and 700 Thespians who would prove to be among the bravest fighters in history. Leonidas organized them into a rotating system. The Spartans would occupy the front, the deadliest position, and then cycle out to allow the allies to fight, keeping the front line fresh. They locked their shields together, creating a wall of bronze and wood that spanned the entire width of the pass. The Persians, observing from the distance, witnessed this wall. They witnessed the crimson cloaks of the Spartans, a colour selected so that blood would not display. They heard the rhythmic chanting of the paean, battle hymns to Apollo. Xerxes delivered the signal. The first wave of Medes and Sicilians surged forward. They ran with a shout, a chaotic, terrifying roar meant to intimidate the adversary. But the Greeks didn't produce a sound. They didn't charge. They merely stood there, knees bent, shields interlocked, spears levelled. The Persians slammed into the Greek formation with the force of a collision. The sound was deafening. The crack of wood, the scream of metal on metal, and the sickening crunch of bodies being crushed by the momentum of the crowd behind them. But the formation didn't break. The geography held. The hot gates had closed. The collision at the hot gates was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was industrial slaughter. To comprehend why the Persians were being butchered so efficiently, we must examine the engineering of the two armies. This was a conflict between two completely different military philosophies, speed and mobility versus weight and discipline. The Persians were designed for the open plains of Asia. They were light, swift, and relied on archers to soften up the enemy before closing in. Their armour was made of quilted linen or fish-scale iron sewn onto leather. Their shields were made of wicker, woven branches that could halt an arrow but were worthless against a heavy strike. Their spears were short, and their swords were daggers. They were built to chase down fleeing enemies, not to crack open a metal shell. The Greeks, and specifically the Spartans, were built for one thing: the collision. They were hoplites, named after the hoplon, a massive concave shield made of wood and covered in a thin layer of bronze. It weighed nearly 20 pounds. When a Spartan stood in formation, his shield covered his own left side and the right side of the warrior next to him. This interlocking design meant that the phalanx was only as strong as the bond between the warriors. If one warrior ran, the wall broke, but Spartans did not run. As the Medes crashed into this wall, they discovered the terrifying geometry of the phalanx. The Spartans were fighting with the dory, a spear 7 to 9 feet long. The Persian weapons were significantly shorter. The result was mathematical. The Persians were dying before they could even get within striking distance of the Greeks. Imagine being in that front line of the Persian attack. You're pushing forward, driven by the weight of thousands of warriors behind you, but you can't reach the adversary. All you perceive is a wall of bronze shields with no gaps. And out of that wall, row upon row of spear points are stabbing with the rhythmic precision of a sewing machine. You grab a spear shaft to break it, and the Spartan simply switches to the secondary weapon on the other end of the spear. The sauritor or lizard killer, a bronze spike used to finish off the wounded on the ground. The Spartans weren't merely killing, they were managing the corpse pile. The efficiency was cold and robotic. As the Persian bodies stacked up, they became an obstacle. The Greeks would step forward, pushing the dead and the dying with their shields, literally paving the ground with their enemies to maintain their footing. This was the othismos, the great shove. It wasn't the cinematic individual duels we witness in movies. It was a rugby scrum of death. The back rows of the phalanx pushed into the front rows, driving the bronze wall forward like a bulldozer. The pressure was so intense that warriors in the front lines could be crushed to death without ever being struck by a weapon. The breath was squeezed out of lungs, ribs were snapped by the weight of the collective mass. For the Persians it was a nightmare. Their wicker shields shattered under the impact of the heavy Greek spears. Their swords couldn't penetrate the solid bronze breastplates of the Spartans. They were fighting phantoms, faceless warriors hidden behind metal helms who never spoke, never screamed, and never stopped stabbing. Herodotus tells us that Xerxes, observing from his golden throne on a nearby hill, jumped to his feet 3 times in terror. He wasn't scared for his own life. He was scared because his worldview was collapsing. He was the king of kings. His army was invincible, and yet he was watching his soldiers being threshed like wheat. By the afternoon, the first wave was broken. The Medes and Scythians retreated, leaving thousands of dead in the narrow pass. The ground was slick with blood, the air thick with the iron smell of gore and the sulphur of the hot springs. The Spartans cleaned their blades, they drank water, they rotated their lines. They hadn't even unleashed their full brutality yet. They knew the first wave was merely a warm-up. They knew Xerxes would not tolerate this insult lightly. They looked up the pass and saw the dust rising again. The king was done dispatching the amateurs. He was dispatching the immortals. As the sun began to descend on that first bloody day, a strange hush fell over the Persian lines. The broken remnants of the Medes were dragged away, and the battlefield was cleared of the worst of the debris. From the Persian camp, a new sound emerged. It wasn't the chaotic shouting of the conscripts. It was the rhythmic, disciplined marching of 10,000 warriors, moving as one organism. Xerxes was playing his ace. He dispatched the immortals. These were not merely soldiers. They were the terrifying elite of the empire. They were called immortals, not because they couldn't die, but because their unit strength was never allowed to drop below 10,000. If a warrior fell, another instantly stepped up from the reserve to assume his place. To the adversary, it seemed as if they were fighting a hydra that could regenerate its heads instantly. They marched in silence, their faces covered by cloth cowls that concealed everything but their eyes. They wore gold jewellery beneath their robes, a sign of their high status, and they carried the finest weapons the empire could produce. They were the emperor's personal shadows, the warriors who had conquered the known world. Xerxes sat back on his throne, confident that this would be the conclusion of it. The Spartans were exhausted, covered in gore, and dehydration was setting in. The immortals would simply walk over them. But as the elites closed in on the hot gates, they encountered the same physics problem that had destroyed the conscripts. The immortals were masters of open-field maneuverability. They were trained to dance around an adversary, to utilize flexibility and speed. But inside the pass there was no room to dance. The Spartans witnessed them approaching and realized these warriors were dangerous. The immortals were heavier than the Medes, better armored with iron scales beneath their colorful tunics, but they still carried shorter spears and wicker shields. The technological gap remained. When the two elite forces collided, the result was a grinding stalemate. The immortals threw themselves at the bronze wall with suicidal bravery. They grabbed the Spartan spears with their bare hands, attempting to snap the wood. They attempted to crawl under the shields to hamstring the Greeks, but the phalanx was a machine designed to reject foreign objects. The Spartans stabbed, pushed, and stepped forward, their heavy shields smashing into the faces of the Persian elite. Then the Spartans executed something that appeared like a disaster. They broke. Suddenly, the Greek formation shattered. The Spartans turned their backs and began to run in a panicked, disorganized mob toward the rear of the pass. The Immortals, witnessing their invincible adversary finally routing, released a roar of triumph. They broke their own disciplined formation and charged forward to cut down the fleeing Greeks, abandoning their ranks in the thrill of the chase. It was a trap. This was a maneuver that required nerves of steel and absolute trust in your commander. Running away with your back exposed is the most dangerous thing a soldier can execute. But at a silent signal, the fleeing Spartans planted their feet, spun around 180 degrees in unison, and lowered their spears. The Immortals, now a disorganized crowd running at full speed, ran directly into a fresh wall of spear points. The slaughter was catastrophic. The momentum of the Persian charge was turned against them. Caught off balance, out of formation, and unable to stop, they were impaled by the dozens. The Spartans butchered them with mechanical efficiency. This occurred not once, but multiple times. The Spartans played with the Immortals, utilizing their own aggression against them. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They proved that discipline, not numbers, wins battles. By evening, the Immortals were retreating. The psychological impact on the Persian army was devastating. These were the gods of war, the untouchables, and they had been beaten by a group of exhausted old warriors. That night, the mood in the Persian camp was funereal. Xerxes was no longer jumping from his throne. He was paralyzed by indecision. He had thrown his sheer mass at the Greeks, and it failed. He had thrown his best elites at the Greeks, and they failed. He was running out of options. But while the Spartans celebrated their impossible victory, cleaning their wounds and eating their meager rations, a tragedy was unfolding in the darkness above them. The Greeks had won the battle of tactics, but they were about to lose the battle of information. A local man named Ephialtes was making his way to the Persian camp. He wasn't a warrior, he wasn't a general, he was a shepherd, and he carried a secret that was worth more than 100,000 soldiers. He knew a way around the wall. History often turns on the smallest of hinges. For 2 days, the entire might of the Persian Empire had been held back by a few thousand warriors and a clever choice of geography. Xerxes was humiliated. His officers were terrified of his wrath. The invasion of Europe was stalling before it had truly begun. But in the shadows of the Persian camp, a man arrived who would change the fate of the Western world. His name was Ephialtes. In pop culture, Ephialtes is often depicted as a deformed monster, a hunchback rejected by Spartan society. This is a dramatic invention. The historical reality is far more mundane and, in a way, far more disturbing. Ephialtes was a local Greek, a Trachinian shepherd. He wasn't a monster. He was merely a man who craved wealth. He looked at the slaughter at the hot gates, looked at the desperation of the great king, and saw a business opportunity. He approached Xerxes' generals and told them what they had been praying for. There was a back door high in the mountains above Thermopylae. There was an old goat track known as the Anapeia path. It wound through the forests of Mount Kallidromos and dropped down behind the Spartan wall. It was steep, difficult, and hidden by thick oak forests, but it was passable. For a bag of gold, Ephialtes offered to guide the Persians through the darkness. Xerxes didn't hesitate. Under the cover of night, he detached the Immortals, the same warriors who'd been humiliated hours earlier, and dispatched them up the mountain. Imagine the tension of that climb. Thousands of Persian soldiers moving in the pitch black, guided by a traitor. The path was covered in dry oak leaves. Herodotus gives us a chilling auditory detail. The atmosphere was so still that the sound of thousands of feet crunching on the dry leaves sounded like a roaring wind moving through the trees. Up on the mountain, Leonidas had stationed 1,000 Phocian hoplites to guard this exact route. He had anticipated the flank. These warriors were supposed to be the cork in the bottle. If they held the path, the Spartans below were safe. But as the Phocians heard the crunching of leaves and witnessed the torches of the Immortals emerging from the woods, they committed A catastrophic mistake. The Phocian commander witnessed the massive Persian column and assumed the Immortals were approaching to attack them. Panicked, the Phocians retreated from the narrow path to the summit of a nearby hill, forming a defensive circle to make their last stand. They prepared to die fighting for their homeland, but the Persians didn't care about them. The Persian commander Hydarnes witnessed the path open up. He commanded his archers to fire a few volleys to keep the Phocians pinned down, and then simply marched his army past them. He ignored the Phocians completely. It was a tactical blunder of epic proportions. By retreating to a better defensive position, the Phocians had inadvertently opened the door to Greece. They stood on their hill, weapons ready, observing in horror as the Immortals streamed past them, disappearing down the trail toward the sea, toward the rear of the Spartan formation. Down below, in the pre-dawn light, the camp runners rushed to Leonidas's tent. The news was grim. The seers had examined the entrails of the sacrifice and predicted death. Lookouts ran in breathless. The Persians are behind us. The pincers had closed. The geography that had been their greatest weapon had just been turned against them. The hot gates were no longer a shield. They were a tomb. Dawn, day 3. The atmosphere was cold, but the news was colder. Scouts came stumbling into the Greek camp, breathless and pale. The Immortals are descending the mountain. The trap had snapped shut. Leonidas called a final council of war. He looked at the faces of his allies, warriors from Corinth, Arcadia, and Mycenae. They had fought bravely, but now staying meant certain death. Leonidas executed something that proves he was a strategist, not merely a warrior. He didn't demand they die with him. He commanded them to depart. He recognized that Greece would require every sword for the battles to come. There was no point in throwing away 7,000 lives when 1,500 would serve the same purpose. He told them to retreat south, to regroup, to protect their cities. But Leonidas himself could not depart. Spartan law was explicit. Retreat was not an option. A Spartan king did not run. Moreover, there was a prophecy from the Oracle of Delphi given months earlier. Either your glorious city will be sacked by the Persians, or the Lacedaemonians will mourn the death of a king. Leonidas chose to be the sacrifice that saved his city. However, the history books and the movies often stop there. They tell us that 300 Spartans stood alone. This is the greatest injustice of the Thermopylae legend. When the dust of the retreating allies settled, Leonidas looked around and witnessed that he was not alone. 700 warriors from the city of Thespians, led by their general Thermopylae, refused to obey the order to retreat. We must pause to appreciate the Thespians. The Spartans were bred for war. They were fulfilling a lifetime of indoctrination. The Thespians were not. They were citizens, farmers, and craftsmen. They possessed no law compelling them to stay. They possessed no prophecy. Their city was not safe behind the Spartan peninsula. It lay directly in the path of the Persian army. By staying, they were essentially guaranteeing that their hometown would be burned to the ground. Yet they stayed. They chose to stand and die beside the Spartans simply because they believed it was the right thing to execute. There were also 400 Thebans, though history is divided on whether they stayed as volunteers or as hostages to ensure Thebes' loyalty. And we must not forget the Helots, the Spartan servants, and light infantry, who likely stood and died in the hundreds, unrecorded by history. So it wasn't 300 against the world, it was roughly 1,500 warriors facing a tsunami. As the sun rose, the realization settled over the camp. There would be no rotations today, no relief, no sleep. Leonidas gathered his warriors. He didn't offer them hope, he didn't promise a miracle, he offered them clarity. According to legend, he turned to his comrades and delivered one of the most badass lines in military history. He didn't tell them to pray, he told them to eat. Eat a good breakfast, warriors, for tonight we dine in Hades. It was a grim joke, a dark acceptance of their reality. They weren't fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the body count. The goal had shifted from holding the path to inflicting maximum trauma on the enemy psyche. They wanted to make the Persians pay such a high price for these last few yards of dirt that they would never forget the name of Sparta. The shields were tightened. The last drops of water were shared. The 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, and the 400 Thebans turned to face the Persian Ocean one last time. On the third day, the sun rose on a different kind of army. The Spartans and Thespians recognized they were surrounded. The tactical game was finished. There was no longer a need to hold the formation or preserve energy. There was only one objective remaining: to eliminate as many Persians with them as possible before the end. Leonidas commanded the warriors to abandon the safety of the narrow Phocian wall. They marched out into the wider part of the pass, a suicidal move that allowed them to engage more enemies at once. They didn't wait for the Persians to attack. They charged. This wasn't a phalanx anymore. It was a brawl. The Greeks crashed into the Persian lines with the fury of warriors who have already accepted their own deaths. They drove the Persians back, toppling them into the sea, trampling them into the mud. Herodotus tells us that the Persian commanders had to stand behind their own troops with whips, lashing them to force them forward against the Greek demons. In this initial furious charge, the inevitable occurred. Leonidas, king of Sparta, was struck down. In Hollywood, the hero usually dies last, alone, after a dramatic monologue. History is not so kind. Leonidas likely died early in the final skirmish, pierced by Persian arrows or spears. But his death sparked the most intense moment of the entire battle. In ancient Greek warfare, the body of a king was sacred. To lose it to the adversary was a disgrace worse than defeat. A furious struggle erupted over his corpse. It was a scene straight out of the Iliad. The Spartans, witnessing their king fall, surged forward. They didn't fight for ground. They fought for his body. 4 times the Persians attempted to drag him away, and 4 times the Greeks drove them back, hacking through piles of enemy dead to retrieve their fallen leader. Against all odds, they succeeded. They dragged Leonidas back to their lines, a final act of loyalty to the man who had led them to hell. But the weapons were failing. The heavy spears the dory had shattered long ago. The warriors drew their xyphos, short leaf-shaped iron swords designed for close-quarters butchery. They hacked until the blades dulled or snapped, and then the most chilling phase of the battle began. Herodotus writes a sentence that still haunts historians today. When their spears were broken and their swords were gone, the Spartans and Thespians continued to fight with their hands and their teeth. They were tearing at the invaders like wild animals. It was primal, naked violence. They were punching armoured warriors, strangling them with bare hands, and biting into throats. It was a display of ferocity that terrified the Persians. Even with their overwhelming numbers, the Persians stopped charging. They were too afraid to get close to these unarmed, bloodied madmen. Slowly, the weight of numbers pushed the surviving Greeks back. They retreated one last time, past the wall to a small hillock known today as Kolonos Hill. They formed a small, tight circle. The Immortals arrived from the rear, sealing the trap. The Greeks were completely surrounded. Xerxes had witnessed enough. He didn't want to lose any more warriors in hand-to-hand combat against these monsters. He commanded his army to pull back. The archers stepped forward, thousands of them. They raised their bows and blotted out the sun. The end didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with a whisper, the sound of thousands of arrows falling like rain. The last Spartans and Thespians didn't die fighting. They died huddled together, buried under a storm of iron. When the last bowstring snapped and the dust settled, a heavy silence fell over the pass. The hot gates were finally open, but the price of admission had been astronomical. On the small mound of Kolonos Hill, the bodies of the last defenders were so thickly covered in arrows that they resembled a strange bristling forest. This isn't merely a poetic description. In 1939, archaeologists excavating that exact hill discovered thousands of bronze Persian arrowheads buried in the soil. You can still witness them in museums today, twisted, corroded bits of metal that serve as physical proof of the storm that ended the Spartan resistance. Xerxes walked through the battlefield. The sight must have turned his stomach. While he had won, he had lost an estimated 20,000 warriors to a force that was a fraction of his size. Among the dead were 2 of his own brothers and many of the empire's highest-ranking nobles. Herodotus tells us that Xerxes was so terrified of his own army witnessing the scale of the disaster that he commanded a massive cover-up. He had trenches dug and quickly buried most of his own dead, leaving only about 1,000 visible, attempting to trick the rest of the fleet into thinking the victory had been easy. It was the first recorded instance of military propaganda spin in history. But his true fear and rage were reserved for one warrior. When the Persian soldiers finally identified the body of Leonidas from the pile of corpses, they brought the news to the king. In Persian culture, bravery was highly praised. Usually, a valiant enemy king would be treated with honor, his body returned or buried with rites. Xerxes had previously shown respect to other captured enemies, but not this time. The 3 days of humiliation, the loss of his brothers, and the shattering of his aura of invincibility had broken something in Xerxes. He commanded Leonidas's head to be severed and his body to be crucified, impaled on a stake for all to witness. This was a shocking violation of religious law and international custom. It was taboo. By mutilating the body, Xerxes wasn't showing strength. He was showing weakness. It was a tantrum. He was attempting to kill the legend of the warrior because he couldn't defeat his spirit. As the Persian army prepared to march south toward Athens, leaving the headless body of the Spartan king to rot, a terrifying realization began to spread through the ranks. Demaratus, the exiled Spartan, had warned Xerxes before the battle. Now Xerxes asked him a question that revealed his anxiety. How many more of them are there? Demaratus looked at the carnage, looked at the dead immortals, and replied, "There are many great cities in Greece, but there is one called Sparta, and in that city there are 8,000 more warriors, just like these." The colour must have drained from Xerxes' face. He had spent days and 20,000 lives to eliminate 300. The math was terrifying. If he had to fight 8,000 of them, he wouldn't possess an army left to conquer anything. The Battle of Thermopylae was a tactical defeat for the Greeks. The road to Athens was open. The city would burn. But strategically and psychologically, the Persians had already lost. They were no longer marching as conquerors. They were marching as warriors who knew they could bleed. A few months after the slaughter, a stone pillar was erected at the site of the battle. It bore an inscription written by the poet Simonides, a couplet so simple and haunting that it has been memorized by soldiers for 2,500 years. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Thermopylae was, by definition, a defeat. The pass was lost. Athens was captured and burned to the ground. If the story concluded there, Leonidas would be nothing more than a footnote, a foolish king who threw away his life. But the story didn't conclude there. The 3 days bought by the 300 were the most expensive time in history. They bought just enough time for the Athenians to evacuate their city and for the Greek fleet to regroup. A few weeks later, at the Battle of Salamis, the Greeks broke the back of the Persian navy, and 1 year later, at the Battle of Plataea, the prophecy of Demaratus came true. The Spartans finally mobilized. They didn't dispatch 300 warriors, they dispatched thousands, led by Pausanias, the nephew of Leonidas. The full might of the Spartan war machine smashed the Persian army into the dust. The invasion was finished. The sacrifice at the hot gates didn't merely save a country, it saved an idea. It preserved the fragile experiment of Greek democracy, art and philosophy, the foundations of what we now call Western civilization. If the Spartans had run, if they had taken the easy way out, the world we inhabit today might look vastly different. We remember them not because they won, but because they showed us the ultimate definition of freedom. Freedom isn't merely living without chains, it's the ability to look at overwhelming odds, to look at certain death, and still possess the will to say no. When Leonidas bellowed, "Molen Labe, come and take them," he wasn't merely talking about his weapons, he was talking about his dignity. He was declaring that there are things more valuable than life itself. Today, a modern statue of Leonidas stands at Thermopylae. Underneath his bronze feet, those two words are still carved in stone, a warning to oppressors, a promise to the free: come and take them. If you've stuck with me to the end of this journey, you're clearly someone who values the deep, gritty, and often uncomfortable truths of our past. If this story moved you, please make sure you're subscribed and have the bell notification turned on. I have a lot more forgotten history to uncover with you. And before you go, I have a question for you to answer in the comments. In our modern world where safety is often prioritized above all else, do you think the Spartan mindset still has a place? Or is it a dangerous relic of a violent past? I'll be reading your thoughts below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter of History.